Okay, Amy, I think we are ready.
Thank you, James. Hello and welcome to all of you. Thank you for joining us today. We are very excited to launch our new series, Digging Deeper. And this Digging Deeper presentation is about evidence-based best practices in performance assessment, how asset-based learning and developing equity educators is a goal. So we are excited to be with you today and eager to get this new series started. And with that, we'll introduce the performance assessment team from the Commission on Teacher Credentialing. My name is Amy Rising. I'm the Chief Deputy Director for the Commission on Teacher Credentialing and Directing Performance Assessment Development. And I'm joined by my colleagues in order. Zoltan, would you like to say hello?
Hi, everybody. Welcome. We're so glad you're here today. I'm Zoltan Sarda, and I am the consultant focused on general education Cal TPA.
Great. Thank you, Zoltan. And James?
Hi, good afternoon. Thank you for being here. I'm James Webb, and I am the consultant working with the education specialist, Cal TPA.
Thank you for being with us today. And Gay Roby is with us. Gay, would you like to say hello?
Thank you very much. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for coming. I think you're in for a real treat in the next 90 minutes. And I thank you all for your participation as well.
Wonderful. We're going to move on to our next slide and introduce the panels. And Gay, I'll turn it back to you for that.
We are fortunate enough to have 4 people join us from 4 programs to share their context about asset-based learning and equipping equity leaders or developing equity leaders. The first is Paul Bailey, who's joining us from CSU Chico, and will be sharing from a general education Cal TPA lens. Second is Jennifer Critch. She's from Point Loma Nazarene, although I think she's in the Bakersfield campus. And she will be coming from a special education Cal TPA viewpoint. Thirdly, we have Tanika Orange will be speaking. She's down 1, and we're reading backwards now. And Tanika joins us from UCLA, sharing Cal APA with us. And then our last speakers come in a group. Wesley Henry, Ann Blankenship Knox, and Sarah Juganatos they are together doing a chapter in a book. So they are bringing us a collaborative viewpoint from CSU Sacramento and the University of Redlands. However, Sarah had another appointment, so she's here with us in spirit. But we welcome all of them. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm sure the participants will enjoy every word.
So we have some norms that we would like to review with everyone. Many of them will probably be a review, but we just wanted to ensure that we have some norms to work with our information to present for you today. So please know that your microphone's been muted. If you are asked to unmute, please do so. But if you are not speaking, please keep your microphone muted so that we can eliminate background noise. We will be using our chat room today. So we do ask that you enter your name and affiliation section for attendance purposes. We just want to make sure that we know who's with us today. So if in the chat, you could go ahead and write your name and your affiliation so that we have an accurate attendance. And then please, throughout the webinar, comment on any ideas that come forward, questions that you may have, relevant research that's related to asset-based learning and equity leadership, because we do want this to be a community that we can build to rely upon each other as we are collaborating and working forward. We do ask that you pose your questions to a general focus rather than candidate or assessment specific, just so that we can make sure that we get all the information through that we have for you today in these 90 minutes. We do ask that you avoid multitasking. Go ahead and tell your brain that you are in a webinar and you are going to receive a lot of great information. And so in doing that, we can honor the time for participants and presenters by monitoring your participation today. So with that, I'm going to turn it to Zoltan to just talk a little bit about asset-based learning.
Yeah, thanks everyone. And again, this is the definition of asset-based learning from our glossary. I'll leave it to you to read, but the thing that strikes me with reading this is that It's the antithesis of having a empty glass sort of, or empty vessel sort of model of education, that we're really viewing teachers and children as coming to the classroom with rich, deep lives from which with comprehensive knowledge that we can build on, and that bring a more diverse perspective to the entire group. So we can go to the next slide as well. And again, thinking about what are the ways of diversity we can experience in the classroom. So again, thinking, culture, individual traits and intelligences, and then also, again, those deep, unique experiences and skills that students and teachers bring to this. And I know all of our presenters are going to be touching on these aspects in a variety of ways today.
And when we do think about asset-based learning for students, it really leads itself well into equity-driven leadership. And so the idea that information as teachers or other school personnel move into leadership positions, recognizing these three ideas that are in the Cal APA, just knowing that schools are complex, that they are made up of a number of different individuals, and all those different individuals are important for the school to run, and also for providing equitable learning opportunities for all students. That the way that school change is best moving forward is through systemic change and building capacity among all the various stakeholders that are within the organization, and that creating that shared vision and articulating it on a consistent basis where all students means all students, that they are engaged, they're inspired, and that all voices are heard from our students, as they are the ones whom we are working with in these different schools. So I'm going to turn it to Gay to look at our topics for discussion.
So because we are coming at the same topics from different viewpoints, we offered our panelists 4 different questions to focus on today. The first one is about defining asset-based learning and equity-focused. What does that mean to you, to your faculty, and to your candidates that are in your preliminary or even your induction, preliminary preparation candidates? Secondly, in designing it, how have you built opportunities into your program to address these 2 concepts of asset-based learning and equity leadership? And then thirdly, practicing. How does equity translate into your coursework activities or your fieldwork assignments so that your candidates experience both of these concepts? Fourthly, then advising. What's your best advice for programs that are going to be building, preparing, equipping educators to keep this equity mindset and keep focusing on asset-based learning?
All right, so it looks like it's time for me to talk to y'all. Just so you know, so my name is Paul Bailey. I'm from Chico State, and I'm coming at this from looking at this through the lens of a professor that works in supporting candidates that are going to be credentialed in a general ed pathway. So some points I wanted to kind of make broadly. First, one, that performance assessment is giving us the opportunity, or really giving candidates the opportunity, to highlight their own assets in planning and teaching in an inclusive and affirming learning environment. So the idea here is, and I think the reason why I mention this, I think this is important to understand from sort of the candidate's perspective, right? They're looking at this as, and reasonably so, as a high stakes assessment that impacts their learning, impacts their careers and all of this stuff, right? And so it can be easy for them to focus on sort of like, what do I have to do, right? This sort of banking model of education view of assessment, right? But the intent behind performance assessment is to give these candidates that already have a lot of strong intuition, some good skills, and some other skills that they're developing that are going to be strong in the future, and highlight those in that kind of a context. So this performance assessment provides them some opportunities that we should probably be upfront with them and tell them that this is an opportunity to do so. And then also these assessments that they engage in when we're talking about performance assessment heavily rely on the use of rubrics. And rubrics are intended as a tool to help us provide students with transparency. So again, me thinking about this through the lens of someone who's supporting candidates going into K-12 education is that we're sort of modeling this use of rubrics as a tool for them as well to create transparent assessments in order to provide the most opportunity for students to be successful in demonstrating what it is that they know, regardless of what their assets and backgrounds are. So I think I'm ready. So some things I'm going to kind of touch on here in my piece that jumped out at me as things that are important for the candidates that we see in our field. One is that I like to tell colleagues and candidates both that assets based is assets first. So I know my experience as a student going through K-12 education, going through my undergrad and even grad school, is that most folks, my experience as a learner was that most folks who were teaching me were focused on what it was that I was lacking. What was I missing or not good at, right? And that sort of framed the planning and the supports that came out of that model of planning and that mindset. And the reality is that our students have gone through that, our candidates go through that, and if we don't find ways to break that cycle, it can be easy to fall back on that. So instead of thinking as like, okay, these students have deficits and I'm going to try to then talk about assets is sort of a cumbersome way to try and get at the point here, right? So if we remember that we should be looking at assets first, these are the strengths that our students, even our candidates, their students in K-12 classrooms are going to be bringing into these classrooms, then we can start really changing sort of the culture of education from pre-K all the way up through post-secondary education by sort of changing how we view or our perspective on assets versus deficits. And so one of the things I wanted to just point out briefly, and I'll talk about this more in the next slide, is that a lot of times the things that candidates and experienced teachers even are viewing or identifying as deficits could actually be assets depending on how we model our lessons and how we plan our lessons, and additional supports in and outside of the classroom. The second thing that I'm going to talk about is just being explicit about our curriculum. And one of the ways that we can do that is also through modeling. So one of the things I try to ask myself a lot when I'm thinking through a lesson or a seminar or workshop activity for my candidates is, am I engaging in the practices that I am trying to get my students to engage in? And if so, how can I make sure that that modeling is explicit and that I'm helping them connect these ideas between practice and theory? And then also to, again, just to kind of connect that, even just from that whole asset-based mindset, right? Thinking I'm going to put assets first and build my lessons and activities around that mindset. And then I mentioned here, get meta, but really what I think is important for candidates is they need opportunities. And this gets to sort of the original point about the advising piece, right? How do we get them to carry this with them well into their careers? So by getting meta, I mean, help them developing those metacognitive skills that they need to become self-reflective, lifelong learners within their profession. And one of the ways that we can do this is through sort of modeling some of that ourselves, but also providing them with structured and explicit opportunities for them to think through, what is my practice? What is working? What is not? What are my strengths? And where do I have opportunities for growth? Okay, so again, going back to that point one, we got to kind of flip the script here. This idea that historically we've been sort of looking at, and by we, I just mean this educational system, right? This whole big monstrosity that we're all trying to help navigate at the same time, is that it's been deficit focused for so long. And so we need to start changing that script. And so I included some specific examples. These are sort of from my own like personal and professional experiences. But one of the things is that this was experience for me as an English learner growing up. And this is a thing that I notice with candidates and veteran teachers as well, is a lot of times we look at English learners with their language skills as being a deficit. English learners are often viewed as, okay, well, they don't speak English yet, not they do currently already possess a lot of strong and important and valuable language and communication skills. And so being able to just flip that around and say, wait a second, they're in EL, therefore they're coming with these assets that are going to support them in their learning, as well as help support their peers in learning in these environments, can change how we frame planning, learning, and assessment experiences for these students. So another example that I like to use, one, because it comes up a lot for our candidates, but again, relating this to myself. So folks that are neurodivergent, I have ADHD. So I think a lot about how like, what do students that experience what I experienced go through in the classroom, and how do we address this, right? A lot of times just those things, this deficit of attention, and really it's kind of a funny way to frame it, because ultimately that's not the problem, but it's named after the symptoms. But I'm diverging a little bit here. The point being is, a lot of times our students that have, say, ADHD, for example, might have really strong strengths that they've developed as part of coping or navigating this very traditional system with some of their mental and academic strengths that are often not valorized by the system, or haven't been historically valorized by our system of education. So being able to look at and say, oh, this is an extremely social, outgoing person. We can use these strengths of social and outgoing communication skills to help support their learning and the learning of their peers, rather than looking at this like, how do I manage behaviors, or how do I deal with what I'm perceiving as deficits that are inherent in this student. So also, and I mentioned this already, but we should model the behaviors and the mindsets that we want to see in our candidates. And so one of the ways that is really effective for our credential candidates, especially in our early practice teachers, in getting them to understand more about what does it mean to engage in culturally responsive pedagogy? What does it mean to have an equity-minded focus in the development of our lessons and in the way that we conduct assessment in our own classrooms? And so the way we can help show that, aside from talking about, the scholarship, giving folks readings to do, is modeling those same behaviors. So some key examples here, transparent assessment practices with which the students understand what the expectations are and how they can be successful on assessments is an important part of a culturally responsive pedagogy. So then I ask myself, when I'm trying to model these same behaviors, is how do I make these assessments that I'm going to give my candidates transparent as well, so they can see this in practice and they can engage in it from the learner side as well. Are your class policies responsive to the diverse need of your students? Sometimes in post-secondary context, we have this habit of sort of holding students at the post-secondary level to a different standard than what we might hold ourselves, or what we might hope that they will hold their students when they're in K-12 education. And do we model concrete strategies for getting to know your students, right? Like this whole beginning, just to frame it in Cal TPA for a second here, that whole first cycle one, right? Like getting to know your students is an important part. It's there for a reason. There are a lot of benefits that we get out of getting to know our students, but sometimes candidates, this is new to them. Being in front of a whole class, wrangling a bunch of kids all at one time, right, is a new thing. And so sometimes you have to be concrete with them. What are some strategies that they can use if they haven't come across them already themselves, or maybe so that they can identify, yes, those are things I do. I can keep working on these good strategies for getting to know my students, build rapport, and build relationships. And then, do your students have opportunities to critically reflect on their own learning experience and connect their ideas to practice? Again, this is going to dovetail right into the next slide, but this idea that these students need to be able to think about their own teaching and learning so that they can continually improve upon their teaching and learning practices. So again, getting into the metacognition now, I think a huge piece of this is we want to nurture teachers, future teachers, educators that are going to be self-reflective and that they're going to go through this naturally and regularly on their own without folks having to tell them to do so. And so one of the ways, again, getting back to modeling, do you share your rationale for your assignments or your rationale for policies that may have been pre-decided before these candidates enrolled in your classes? Because providing that rationale gives them a lot more concrete ideas for like, what is the purpose for why we do these so that they can better understand how to either take these into their own classroom or modify them so that it works for their own setting. And then do you provide opportunities to decentralize power, that is giving candidates agency over their own learning? Because part of this equity-minded or culturally responsive pedagogies, a lot of that has to do with being able to give power back to our students, especially our students from groups that have typically had more power stripped from them than others in learning contexts. And so if we don't provide opportunities for our candidates to have agency over their own learning, it's going to be difficult for them to develop the same skills and the comfort, because this is kind of uncomfortable to give away some of our power as educators to our students sometimes. And so when we get them comfortable with some of that sort of change in practice compared to what they might be used to, then they can help continue to develop those skills as well. And then do your students have an opportunity to engage in peer review? So this is, again, this is where it starts to get a little bit muddy, but in the process of also providing feedback and reviewing the work of peers, they're going to start to develop some strategies for just evaluating the same work that they're doing, right? If it's peer review, they're engaged in the same type of work. And so by going through some evaluation and feedback processes with their peers, they'll be able to think through and have some concrete strategies for how they might also do that same type of reflection or review of their own work. And are candidates reflecting on their strengths? I ended with this, but this is always the first thing that comes to my mind when I'm thinking about how do we support candidates as they're just learning really just so many things in a program, right? Is, do they understand what they're doing well? Because it's really easy for teachers, and I'm sure we've all been there, to really spend a lot of time and energy and emotion focusing on the things that aren't going well for us, right? Those are the most stressful interface things. So providing students with the opportunities to sit back and say, hey, these are the things that are working, and to identify them and really be able to say, okay, here's how I can keep using these strengths that I have. And again, to kind of complete the cycle, now that's one more way that we're helping students focus on their assets, and we're making it assets first for their experience to help kind of round out this whole set of ideas.
Okay, Paul, thank you so much for that information. And Amy and I have included everyone to share, how do you model asset-based teaching in your course or with your class of candidates? So as we are continuing forward, please share ideas. and shared a really great idea. So we want you to continue. We want this to be interactive. So please share ideas, and maybe you can take away something that could work with your students. So now I'd like to introduce Jennifer Critch from Point Loma Nazarene. I have worked with Jennifer for the past year and a half, almost 2 years, on the development of the Education Specialist Cal TPA. So Jennifer, if you will unmute, and I will produce for you and access and move forward in the slides.
Thank you, James. It's so nice to be here with everyone. And I just wanted to say what a gift it was to go after Paul, because first I want to say thank you, Paul, for using neurodivergent. Special ed has been a place where people have decided that kids go to, and changing our words changes our thoughts, which then changes our actions, right? So thank you for those great words. And I want to point out something that we've done in special ed. Oh, before I go on, I meant to say, can everyone just take 1 second and write down a question that they have about special ed and the TPA, or assets-based, and just enter that into the chat right now. And then if I don't cover it, I can come back to it and I can see if I can answer your question. So just take 20 seconds and enter a question into the chat you might have about special ed. But we use people first language in special ed, so we don't say, we say the child and then their disability. And I think Paul hit something very important when he said, let's use assets first. Let's talk about assets first before we talk about anything else. So it's the same idea as using people first language in a conversation. So I'm going to capitalize and move a little bit farther along, because what we've done is when the TPAs first came out, Point Loma decided we were going to have all of our candidates, including our special ed folks, take the Gen Ed TPA. And we just built our program from that point on, including them in the TPA. And one of the things we noticed was that they needed to practice using the UDL. UDL was a new concept at that time. And so we've had our candidates using the UDL lesson plan in every single course. We have them reflecting on the development of their lesson plan and how they provide an assets-based learning, asking them those specific questions, introducing them to the vocabulary that is in the TPA from the very first course in the program. We use a clinical practice planner, and Gay, would you like to share that real quick with everyone?
As soon as the unshare happens, I will share.
Perfect. And the reason that we decided to go to this planner is we found that they were struggling with keeping their ideas focused. So this little planner is just something my Lori Call, one of my instructors, put together, and if you can just slowly scroll through, and I'll talk about it. And it just helps them look at what is coming up, what notes do they need to take. So we're kind of teaching them how to use a planner, but we're also pointing out the important things in the assessment guide that's provided by the TPA. And then if you'll keep going, scroll all the way to the glossary. Yeah, keep going. I can't remember what page it's on. I
I
apologize.
want to know what that checkerboard is, though.
Oh, that's just a calendar. So they can write out what each of, so when they're planning for the month, they can say, this is important for me to take care of on this day. So basically right there, that's cycle one.
Oh.
So just showing them, having our professors model what we want them to do in the classroom. So we're modeling it for them through this little planning instrument. Just pointing out the essentials of the Cal TPA. And then if you can go to the next one, what is in each of the steps. So that takes the guesswork out of them reading that assessment, and it focuses on what we felt like was important for them to pay attention to. And then one of the big things that we failed as a university to do was to teach the words in the glossary. So if you'll keep, did we miss the glossary? We might have passed, maybe it's up further. Anyway, so we got to know our students, and we realized this was something that we needed to provide for them. So it's just a real simple guided practice for them learning and looking at the TPA assessment. Okay, great. Thank you for sharing that, Gay. If anyone has any questions, please feel free to drop them in the chat, and I'm happy to answer questions as best as I can. If you'll go to the next slide. So I want to have everyone right now look at this picture. And if you've seen this before, you've done this before, don't give it away. But when I say go, so don't go yet, but when I say go, I would like for everyone to give your very best guess what you think this is a picture of. No, it's not a very good picture, but I'm going to point something out with what I'm doing with this picture. So I'm going to give you about 15 seconds to think through what this picture is. Type it in, but don't press send yet, and we'll waterfall all of our ideas about what this picture could be. in about 20 seconds. There's no wrong answers. Okay, go. Super. I'm loving what you're putting in the chat. That's great. So one of the designing opportunities that we took is we decided we were going to give our students as many experiences as they could have. And what does that mean? Well, one of the experiences that we use is from Fat City, which is a very old program that shows what it looks like to be a student with a learning disability. So we give them those experiences and then we ask them to reflect on that. And then we ask them to take that then and model what that looks like when they're building their lessons, when they're thinking about the students in their classroom. And one of our big push since TPA has come out is that we want our students to understand that each disability has its own assets. A student with attention deficit disorder is an amazing person of, we know multitasking is a fallacy, right? But we know that those students can jump from one thing to another thing fairly easily because they have really good code switching. So we ask each of our students to look at those 13 disability categories and focus on what are the assets of that disability. And then we expose them to those unique aspects of the disability. And this activity that I just had you do is actually an activity where we explain to our candidates that a person with a visual impairment might have this same struggle when they're looking at this picture. So when you look at this picture and I give you no scaffold, I don't tell you anything about it, it's a very difficult picture to look at. But let me show you what the next slide looks like when I just simply outline the picture. So now what do you see? Go ahead, type it in the chat. And I did notice a few of you saw the count earlier, so you have some very good visual cues. But isn't that amazing that a simple scaffold of outlining changes the trajectory of that learning? So what we've discovered is that we're going to add scaffolds when necessary, and we're going to do them in the house of UDL. We're going to add scaffolds of expression, teaching kids to know what their preferences are. How do you prefer to tell us how you know this? Giving them, like Paul said, clear, transparent rubrics, and then tying those to the standards and making sure they're pulling the anchor standards out. We have asked them to build scaffolds of engagement. We want to optimize choice. We want to give kids power. We want to decentralize the power from the sage on the stage and let students decide how they're going to stay engaged in this. Maybe it's on an exercise ball. Maybe it's walking around the room while you're lecturing. We want to foster a community of collaboration and celebration. So making sure that kids feel wanted and safe, and then helping them facilitate personal coping skills. And what we found is we needed to do that for our teachers because our teachers were really struggling with the burnout and I can't go on in special ed because it's so hard. And then adding a scaffold in representation, customizing the display of your information, clarifying vocabulary words or symbols, activating and supplying background knowledge if necessary. So our job was to get to know our candidates, and then that piece of instructing in multiple means of expression, multiple means of engagement, multiple means of representation changed with every course that we were building. We kept the standards the same, trying to teach those TPEs, but we made sure we were covering what the students needed us to cover, building off their assets. Next slide, thank you. So how did we practice that? Well, we wanted to build rich interactive learning environments, and we based that on using a TPA to guide smaller assignments in each course. So in the very first course, we talk about getting to know your students, and they do an assignment on getting to know your students. We talk about how to find barriers to learning, and they have to do a little assignment for barriers to learning. We use case studies using actual scenarios for students to solve and interpret. We found that the best work is where we don't give them the answer, that they come up with really unique and fun answers on their own. And then we reinforce all of this in activities where we have the students practice those concepts and theories with students in live classrooms. It's been a little difficult with the pandemic, but we are still working to have students out in the field practicing what they're learning in our classrooms. Next slide, please. Thank you. And then for our advising, I think the biggest thing we have found is that we really embrace having fierce conversations and being awkward and brave and kind. That quote by Brene Brown is so powerful, isn't it? But we want to encourage our students to be mindful of where they're at and mindful of where their students at. We want them to be looking at themselves as a whole person and taking good care of themselves, having self-care that is meaningful for them, and then showing their students how to use self-care in their classrooms, and then not giving up. Because as we know, this journey, they're going to light the hoop on fire, and then they're going to ask you to jump through it. And then you're going to have 10 more hoops after that to jump through. Having fierce conversations, getting them to think hard about some of the things that they are struggling with, but then sharing what they're really good at, their assets, with other students whose maybe that's not their asset. So having our students in a constant dialogue, finding those blind spots, developing personal goals, and then reflection. If it's not working, we are going back to our TPEs to reinvent something. Let's try something in a different way. And I said it before, but we can't say it enough. Getting to know your candidates, advising them, and fleshing out the pieces of your program that helps them to be successful. And then modeling, again, like Paul said, modeling what you want them to be. Be the teacher that you want them to be. Thank you and I'll go through and I'll look at the questions in the chat right now.
Thank you very much, Jennifer. I think yesterday was National Kindness Day, so that was a perfect note to hit on. Our next panelist is Tanika Orange from UCLA, and she works with the Cal APA students. And Tanika, your turn.
Sure. So thanks for Paul and Jennifer for going ahead, as Jennifer said about Paul, because when I listen to them, I hear the notions of the notion of deliberate teaching in this space. And so for us, when we think about promoting asset-based learning and thinking about equity leaders, we are thinking just like Paul and Jennifer. It has to be deliberate, and with deliberation has to be some radical change, because we do not have any time to wait for anything else, because we've been doing the same thing over and over again. So as we move through the Cal APA assessment, for us, it is to think about how we can be really deliberate and really think about some new radical changes that need to be made around leadership and supporting teachers and communities and spaces that can lead to some different, social outcomes, economic outcomes, just lively, good, joyous outcomes for people that we have missed the mark on for so many years. Next slide for me, thanks. So for us, we really begin thinking about just again, some of the things you've heard from Paul and Jennifer as well, just really who you are and how you step into the space. There's a belief in our program that if you really do not understand your own assets, you do not understand your own lenses that you come into the space with, it's very hard for you to see assets in other folks, because your lens is the predominant lens, and everyone has a predominant lens that they see things through. So we really begin with a personal understanding of who you are and why you see things the way you do. In our program, we really hit on, again, this is about critique, and not just critiquing of a thought or a theory, but it's also laying your own critiques to rest. Meaning that all the things that are unchallenged in me, all the things that have been unnamed in what I believe and what I see, also have to be laid to rest, so I can welcome Sally maybe to come in and have some other thoughts about things, or Becky to come in and have some thoughts about things. So we really begin with some serious identity work and self-reflection, and this is carried throughout our program. And we expect to see that on our Cal APA as well, because we believe it's the basis for understanding asset learning. You culturally have to understand who you are culturally and racially first, before you can actually begin to support someone else in that. We're asking folks to really critique that, and how do you see that when we think about like a notion of growth mindset? Like, what does that mean based on who you are and your own experiences? It means something different to very different people. Again, and then we think about that, and then we move folks to think about, so what are some intentional ways that we can co-construct some new learning spaces as leaders? What is it that we can do? And as my colleague Joanne Iskin consistently says, what is it that's innovative? What is new? What is it that, what are we continuously recreating that it gets, continuously marginalizes the same groups of folks all the time? So what are we doing that is going to shift and change something new? What can we co-construct that's different? And this is a hard concept for folks when you've gone through an education system and you have indoctrinated the beliefs that this is the way to do it. This is why we have folks that come into a program and continuously say that the way to support students who may be struggling readers is intervention. So we have this thing like, do not tell me you're going to create another intervention program. We've done that for years, and so that's not really the issue. So to think about how can we be imaginative and really come out of the box and think about something new, because we have to be deliberate and we have to be radical if we really want to do and make some changes inside of school spaces. The last part we move them to in thinking about this is to be radical again. That what are we going to do to change things that normalize the way things happen inside of school spaces? And even when they think in their Cal APA about what strategies they're supposed to come up with, we really challenge them to say, are you using colonizing strategies to try to decolonize something? It doesn't make sense to do it that way. So step outside of that. Step outside. What could you do? What could you imagine? And as hard as it is for our leaders to imagine, we believe it's extremely hard then for teachers and students to reimagine something different than what they already have sitting in front of them. And so it's really getting our leaders to think about something that's different. In order for you to first focus on asset-based learning, you really need to be able to, again, critique, be able to rest your own beliefs. You need to understand your own lens, racial and culturally, where it comes from first. You need to be able to co-construct something that's due and be imaginative. And that in itself is a process. We work on this throughout the entire program. Next slide. When we think about asset-based learning for us, and to be very equity focused as a leader, and how we even think about it again, when we describe this through the Cal APA, we ask our folks to think about education as in a historical context. This is something that I'm still doing, that you cannot move forward and believe around asset-based learning or equity focused if you don't understand the history. And I take in point today the trials that are going on right now, that it is important to understand historically where we are today, where we've come far in education, to talk about systematic racism and to understand its impact that it has on what happens inside of school spaces, because it's important for you to understand the historical context as a leader. You can't understand the assets community bring if you do not understand the historical context. So we spend a lot of time that in order to be equity focused, that is a forefront. You must understand that. There also, for us, when we talk about, again, what's best strategies or how we need to think about systemic change, and again, being equity driven and asset based, is that we have to really have an explicit focus on issues of race and anti-Blackness inside of the space, and how it impacts every single thing we do inside of schools, how it impacts how communities who are marginalized interact with one another, and how it shows and how practices and policies have been in place to support these notions. That again, you can't come to asset-based learning or be an equity leader if we do not understand how these are at play inside of school spaces. So we spent a lot of time to understand, what does this mean? How does it sit? And how do we work towards, moving towards something that gets us to dismantle or disrupt some of the practices that we have inside of schools. And we instill this notion that equity is an inquiry process, and it is a destination, but it's a process. That doing one thing does not lead you to one strategy or one skill or one shift in policy is not a straight line to equity. That it looks like this, and you have to be very comfortable with that. You have to be willing to be flexible and work in the ambiguity of it. Because if it was that easy, I'm quoting again one of my colleagues, if it was that easy, we would have been doing it already. There's a reason why it's not that easy. And this goes back to historical context. This goes back to issues of race and anti-Black racism inside of our educational spaces. And it sits on the notion of our utopia of what we believe equity looks like, because it looks very different to everybody. It looks different. And so it has to be an inquiry process. And if we think of it as an inquiry process, we ask our leaders, when they think about their own strategies inside of Cal APA, to think about what would an inquiry process look like to really set aside time to really focus on action towards issues of equity, not just a best practice, because whatever that means. It's a best practice here, it's not a best practice there. But really what it means in your context, how it shifts over time, and how you have to have dedicated space and time to focus on issues of equity. If you truly want to focus, again, on moving the needle or disrupt practices that just don't reproduce inequity inside of school spaces. When we think about this inside of our classrooms, these are some experiences of what it looks like for our students. That we really ask them to go outside of the box about what they see on just the data. When we ask them to think about data, it's just not, because when we usually look at data, it's very one-dimensional. And it's very, we always say the data focuses on issues of trauma and hurt. That asset-based learning and looking at data wouldn't focus on trauma and hurt, it would focus on something else. And as another researcher that we speak about in our courses quite often, Ivor Tolston would say, instead of asking the question about what the gap is, why don't we look and see what folks who are doing well, what students, the Black students in classes and schools that are doing well, and let's figure out what we need to look at those assets and emulate those inside of our school spaces than trying to make up and do it the other way. So we ask folks to really think about things in different ways. We ask them to think about the intersectionality. It's not just, the English language learner, it is the student who happens to be homeless, the native, the indigenous population student who happens to also be transgender. It is this, that our lives are extremely complex. So understanding who folks are and how we see them and the intersectionality is what we want folks to focus on. So we ask them to, this becomes difficult because oftentimes when you look at data, there is no intersectionality that sits in there. What you do for folks as English learner is one thing, but then you also they intersect with other things as well. Socioeconomic status, religion, all kind of cultural attributes people bring. We look at data through different lenses. And for us, we've started working with the Du Boisian framework. And really the bottom line of that is just to, one, bring in some non-traditional thoughts about how we need to look at data. People that are not just from people who've been marginalized in the field of understanding what data is supposed to look like and how we collect and think about data. And so this framework basically says that you would really need to determine what data you bring in, that good data matches what you end up getting out. And if what we always put in and bring in of data is always data around pain and hurt and destruction, that's pretty much what we end up getting out. When we think about analyzing the data, thinking about who's missed when we analyze data, that if we ask our, and I'm saying our English learners, but if we ask our standard English learners and we have data around them, wouldn't it be great to go back and ask them what they think about the data after you've collected it around your standard English learners? We look at proximal data, which, the Cal APA asks us to do, just they don't use the term proximal data, but they ask us to do. But if we really want to understand new teaching techniques that we want to implement in schools, wouldn't it be interesting to ask parents who've been teaching their kids for a whole year at COVID, instead of saying learning loss, but instead saying, you know what, you've taught your kid for a year. Tell me what I need to do, because I surely don't know everything, but you know a lot. And there's a reason why parents didn't even want to bring their kids sometimes back to school, and just analyze and think about that, right? Like the trauma that it meant to walk inside the spaces. So the good data, how we analyze it, what are we asking to collect, and to think about our data as humanizing. And this is about asset-based learning. This is about what does it mean to take the data that we've done and to humanize it, because behind every single number is a person with a story and a dream. It's not just a number to analyze and to say, what do we need to do to get reading scores up? It's deeper than that. And so we ask them, how are you humanizing data? And so these are the things we ask them to do. And then the last thing, again, goes back to my colleague talking about what can we imagine and do something different. We ask folks to have the courage to break away from the norm, that we don't want to see things that have already been done in the past. You need to come up with something new. And often our candidates will say, well, we don't have the option to do that. We don't have the option to, that's not in our schools. And we say, again, that's the trap that we have in our mind, that we can't move it. And the whole point is that if you can't imagine in this space, and the spaces inside of our institutions, then you won't imagine when you leave. So you got to imagine it now. Regardless if you don't think you can, what can you do? And so this is why we bring in the Boysian framework. We bring in articles that, again, in our classes, they're articles written by folks who are marginalized in the spaces. We look podcasts, and we also have a notion that this isn't sink or swim. This goes back to something that Paul said earlier, that you model this. So everybody here makes it. It's not a sink or swim. And if you don't make it inside of our program, then we need to reevaluate and do something. This is not about sink or swim, because in schools, it shouldn't be about sink or swim also. So when we think about data, we have to think about it as well, not in a sink or swim, but we often look at it in a sinking thing instead of a swimming. Next slide. Trying to go this quick.
Tanika, you have about 5 minutes left.
Okay, just thanks for telling me that. The benefit for students. Now, I don't know if I even answered this question right, because I think when they asked, I was thinking about students in the classroom versus students in our program, but it doesn't actually matter because it fits for both. So for us, all of this benefits our students in the classroom in K-12 and inside of our graduate program, because if you do this, we believe in the notion around culturally responsive and sustaining pedagogy, that the notion is that you feel cared for and not just cared about, because there is a difference. Being cared for means action. And we always tell our candidates that being an equity leader is about action. It's not about just theory and just thinking about what it is, saying that you believe something. It is about the action. Caring for is about action, not just that I care about it. We do care for our students a great deal. And we model that in a ton of different ways, especially in the model of saying this isn't sink or swim. And it's interesting how just, adult learners, we have students who will come up and they're very upset because they miss a deadline for a paper that we prescribed or something, or for some project. And just to tell them that, again, this isn't sink or swim, but they already come in with the mentality that it is, because it's what the education system has already told them that it has to be. So it is the notion of being cared for. And that is a huge concept in culturally responsive pedagogy. It has to be there. Students' cultural assets are part of the instructional practices, whether it's there or what in K-12 or whether it's in the classes that we teach. That it's not just about it's not about content, but it is about what your instruction looks like. So if we say we value students who come in and they have a different communication style, then what is it in our own pedagogy that looks like that validates that cultural norm? It's not just a matter of saying we are, it is a matter of saying this is what we do. So if we can't name it, then our students can't name it, and they won't be able to name it when they become leaders. So I'm always asking, if you say you believe it, tell me in your own space, where is it? Show me in your pedagogy, not just in content, because that's easier. Show me in the pedagogy what it looks like. Show me how you validate, students who have different communication styles. The other way we do it is we think about promotion of independence and questioner versus dependence and assimilation. And if we think about this from like people who read like Zaretta Hammond, she talks about stuff like this all the time. And so the notion for us is that we still have folks who want to be, who are leaders that are out there that are still independent and assimilative, however you say that word, thinkers, right? And so the role for us, when we get our folks to think about their assessments and to think about things, is that how do we promote independence and folks who are questioners? It's not about assimilation to the norm. We've done that many times. It's not working. So what is it we're going to do about creating some independence and questioner versus the dependence and assimilation? And it happens, and we think about this consistently throughout the program. And again, that equity is an inquiry process for us. That we always say it's a cycle. It's never ending. And so you have to think about that as a leader. And so when we think about our processes of how do we center issues of equity inside of places, we make sure that we think about them as a cycle and that it never ends up stopping, that it's just not an end goal. Like we did it. Oh, we got it. We did it. And we know that's not the case because we're talking about the same kids that we've been talking about since before we were all educators, and we'll be talking about when we leave. It calls for deliberate and radical.
Alert from Google Chrome. UCLA and
There we
LESD.
go. Deliberate and radical shifts in what we do. Oh, and advising, I think what I would advise for folks is as a program, we have to consistently interrogate our own ways of being and knowing. We do this, we're always asking, what are we doing? Are we centering the right thing? Does this even matter? Are we really pushing things? Or are we just staying in continuously with the status quo? We say we build support within our own cohort, that the biggest asset I think that we have are the folks that work together and they build and they learn from one another. And we try to do a lot of things to do that. We pay very close attention to our educators of color because we believe that, again, the traumatization that they feel consistently is put on their backs all the time. And when we talk about issues of equity, when we talk about issues of, and we look at data, it is again centered a lot of times in some trauma and pain. And it's very important to pay very close attention to that. And again, we try to stop asking our students to reproduce colonizing methods to try to decolonize the system. We have to be imaginative. We have to do something that's different.
Thank you so much, Tanika. I even love this beautiful graphic you put on here as well.
Okay, great.
M out of impossible. Thank you so much. And then our last set of panelists from University of Redlands, we have Wesley Henry and Annie Blankenship-Knox.
Thanks so much, Gay, and thanks everyone for allowing us to speak with you today. I just want to recognize, as Gay said, our friend and colleague, Sarah Dugunatos from Sacramento State University has a conference presentation elsewhere today, so a conflicting presentation, but I really want to acknowledge Sarah for her leadership in this work as well. And so, as Tanika, I think, really beautifully foregrounded for us, education leadership really requires different ways of thinking about leading in modern schools today. And so front and center for that is really thinking about access and equity for all students, and in particular, creating spaces where traditionally marginalized student populations have equitable access and equitable opportunities, and the ways in which our programs can support that is so important. In addition, principals in particular have to be knowledgeable about all of these other things: content, instructional knowledge and pedagogy, being able to engage stakeholders. Digital access and literacy is increasingly important, as is engaging in mental health for themselves, for their staff, for their students. And our friend Gay, I'm sure, would remind us that if we were to unpack the California Administrator Performance Expectations, there are a few more bullet points that we could add here. And so the really important thing is that the principalship is such an important role for fostering the conditions that really empower student success within the classrooms. And that's really why we're all here today. So we'll hop to the next slide. And one of the things that we'd like to talk with you about today is this notion of leadership preparation meeting these new demands for educational leaders. And so one of the things that's so important is our programs can't impart the technical knowledge for all of the challenges that our candidates might encounter when they are in leadership positions within schools, but we can absolutely work with them to develop analytical and decision-making skills that will be helpful for them as they navigate the challenges that they face. I think the other just sort of reality is that not every aspiring principal went through their initial credentialing program with Paul or Jennifer or any of you who are here today with programs that are really invested in thinking about assets-based learning and equity-based opportunities for teaching and learning. And so one of the ways in which we have come to understand powerful leadership preparation is through these powerful learning experiences. They can help broaden the mindsets of aspiring leaders with a particularly increased emphasis on equity, access, and student learning. And it also prepares these candidates to lead in those complex environments that we've been talking about today. They also take an action-oriented approach. And so some of the other of my colleagues have mentioned case studies and really engaging in these meaningful learning experiences. That sort of sits at the center of powerful learning experiences. So we can hop to the next slide. And I won't go through all of these, but I do want to just note that Dr. Michelle Young, who is now the Dean of the School of Education at LMU, has a really powerful piece about powerful learning experiences. And I think this is so relevant, not only to leadership preparation, but any educator preparation. And so you see so many intersections today between what's on this slide, these 9 powerful learning experience characteristics, and the things that my colleagues have talked about. And that is that these are really reflective opportunities for learning, that they are collaborative, that there's co-creating learning. And so it's not faculty or program supervisors delivering knowledge, that it's you're really co-creating these opportunities to engage in more equitable spaces and more in spaces that offer deeper knowledge and deeper learning. And then finally, the equity-driven leadership really sits at the core of all of these different types of powerful learning experiences. And so now I'll hand it over to my colleague, Annie, who will talk to us about partnerships and some of our other learning frameworks.
Thank you so much, Wesley. I'm really glad that you brought up the concept of co-creating learning opportunities, because I think that is where the real essence of partnerships come from. These partnerships between university-based training programs and districts and schools is so vital in maximizing the opportunities that both provide. I know that university-based principal preparation programs have historically been criticized as being too theory-based, not connected to the field as much, whereas district-based programs may perpetuate some of their own status quo. That problems that persist within that organization are just perpetuated. So by partnering between the two levels of organization, it really creates potential for providing deeper and richer learning opportunities for students. And those partnerships can happen at a lot of different levels. On the curricular side, it can help bridge that gap between theory and practice. It can also help in terms of recruiting aspiring teachers and leaders from underrepresented populations, creating pipelines earlier in the process. I think we're having conversations right now with a school district on how we can start recruiting teachers in middle school, not like folks teaching in middle school, but how we can talk to middle schoolers about being teachers and about what a great career that is. And really cooperating on creating and providing authentic learning experiences. Now, in these partnerships, there has to be investment on both sides, but based on, there's so many different kinds of partnerships, from just basic MOUs that say like, yes, we're going to be friends, to real deep, intense partnerships where you have, you know, advisory councils, you meet regularly, you really co-create curriculum, but everything in there is valid and helpful and creating richer and deeper learning opportunity for students at all levels. So these two approaches are general approaches that we can use, that we use in our leadership development programming, using some specific leadership lenses. So if I can go to the next slide. So we, of course, there are lots of equity focused lenses that are helpful for both leadership preparation and teacher preparation programs. But these are three that we selected as specific lenses that inform our work and can inform curricula in different areas. So next slide. So transformative leadership is perhaps the base level, the least specific but most encompassing of our frameworks. Of course, it's a social justice framework built on the works of Burns and Fieri, made more modern by lots of wonderful scholars in the last couple of decades, Novarez, Shields, for example. And the transformative lens, not to be confused with transformational, really focuses on creating systems that are more equitable and social justice oriented, really challenging the status quo. So leaders are able to use this equity focused lens in all decision and processes. So how, I think it's obvious why to use this. How to use this is, I think, the big question. We encourage incorporating transformative leadership both at the programming level as a tool for the designers and in the curricular level itself. So from a design standpoint, we use it to inform how coursework is designed, the andragogy choices that are made to make sure, as Tanika talked about before, and Jennifer, actually, like really ensuring that the curriculum is accessible to all students and not just that surface level of like, oh yes, we have curriculum for everyone, but show me the evidence. How have you created this in a way that's approachable and accessible to all of your students? The creation of assignments, how they're assigned, and what kind of manipulation is available in those assignments, the kinds of things that are assigned, readings, podcasts, videos, and grading processes. I know that that's really come up for me this semester personally, that my students are really loving video grading mixed with written grading, that both provide different value to them. So other things that we really encourage is having students conduct an analysis of their own school and vision and mission statement, starting with like that tiny first piece of an equity audit. Like, what do you say you do as an organization? And is that what you actually do? using that transformative lens. There's also a really great transformative leadership self-assessment scale designed by Navarez and Wood. I can actually pop that into the chat. But that's a tool that students can engage in and really use that as a tool for reflection and personal growth. So next slide. I'm going to hand it over to Wesley. Oh, sorry, one more slide.
So we'll hop ahead just a slide and we'll talk a little bit about resourcefulness and resource allocation. So I love this, I just love this quote. And so resourcefulness is not about being full of resources, but about how you deploy them, particularly whether you do so in creative ways that address problems. And so we can hop to the next slide. But one of the important things about Cal APA cycles is cycle 1 asks our students to engage in this really deep dive of to do an equity audit and analysis within their schools, and then to lead a community of practice in cycle 2 around a persistent problem of practice that relates to equity challenges that they experience within their schools. And there's not always a resource component to that, but what a powerful opportunity to really bring that in and infuse that into our programs as we're thinking about preparing candidates to be site-based leaders, and especially around CAPE 3 as we're thinking about resource allocation. And so one of the ways in which we really think about this at the program level is because equity-focused leaders who are going to create some sort of change within their school environments are going to need to reallocate resources in ways that disrupt the status quo. And so, you know, those resources may be fiscal, they may be facilities, right? There are all these different types of resources that we help our candidates conceptualize. But often those are just remain unchanged from year to year, and disrupting tradition within these school environments can be a really significant challenge for educational leaders. And so I love that Tanika brought up the notion of being radical previously. And I think that we all know from our work in the K-12 environment is sometimes even the slightest change to some stakeholders seems very radical. And so it's really important that we are building the capacity of our candidates to be able to lead at the school level so that they're able to make those sustainable improvements that really treat the distribution of the resources that are available to them as a long-term investment in creating more equitable opportunities for students. So we'll hop to the next slide. And so some of the ways that we can do this is through infusing opportunities in our programs for candidates to engage in this work. And so they might engage in a budget analysis and identifying priorities that are transparent within their district and priorities that are not transparent and would make their district more equity oriented. They can also engage in equity audits, both of budgets, of master schedules, of extracurricular opportunities, and so on. Drafting a proposal for a resource request to address a specific academic or well-being need is a really powerful way to extend candidates' learning from Cal APA Cycles 1 or Cycle 2. And then finally, assigning interviews with school or district leaders to really better understand the budgeting process and of all of the nuts and bolts of that component, because so many of our leaders step into their positions without a really strong understanding of how the sausage is made. And so this really gives them an opportunity to engage in some of that sticky, difficult work of navigating what resource allocation looks like within their school environments and how to shift it to be more equitable for all of their students. So I'll hand it over now to Annie to talk about equitable systems leadership, which is our last framework.
And Annie, you have about 2 minutes.
No problem. I'll go quickly. So we find that students, when they get to us, are really closely focused on problems within their own school buildings. And as leaders, we need them to zoom out. So this equitable systems leadership lens is a really great way to focus on assets-based learning from a more systems approach. As Bray Boy noted, large-scale educational inequities are rooted in more pervasive systematic and structural issues rather than the individual motivations or giftedness of an individual. So that's where we want our students to focus a lot of their change energy, is at that systems level. Next slide, please. So at the university level, we find that our educational leaders are particularly well positioned to create disruption within their systems because of their positionality, frankly. They are able to disrupt and change things that have led to historical inequities. They're also in a position to engage multiple stakeholder groups at the same time: teachers, students, parents, district, all the way up to the state. At the school level, using this kind of lens allows practitioners who are using this power and authority to act strategically as they build relationships with those throughout the organization and in other organizations. So last slide for me. So how to do this? Some of our suggestions are really looking at the origins of some of these practices and policies that perpetuate inequities, to see how and why they came about. Knowing the real root of the story behind some of these policies and practices can really help us unravel them. Interviewing the people that make decisions about practices and policies to find out about their motivations. And finally, testing our own causal assumptions. Again, this is sort of a Cal APA cycle 1 thing of saying like, well, this is what I think is happening, but let me get input from others so I can test my own bias, my own assumptions about what's happening, and really engage others in determining what's happening and how we can create a systems-wide change. So Wesley, I'm going to hand it back to you to give any closing thoughts.
Yeah, I would just say thank you. And we have included sort of all of the resources that we listed in our slides today. So when the slide deck goes out, you'll have kind of free access to those resources. And we're happy to field any questions, and I'll hand it back to our coordinators here.
Okay, thank you to all our presenters. What great stuff. And I just also really appreciate all the contributions in the chat. We are going to save the chat and we'll publish this with the presentation as well as with the video. So we have a few minutes left, but I imagine that there's a lot of inspiration in the group right now. A lot of people who are thinking about some ideas to move their practice forward, some epiphanies in terms of this practice. I wonder if there are either in the chat, or if we'd like to just unmute, if you have a quick burning question, either a question or an idea or something that you're going to carry from this webinar today. Maybe if we could see the group, would that be possible? Thank you. All right. I'm seeing lots of affirmation about the presentations today. That's okay. Taking back and using immediately. Thank you, Chris, for all your contributions to the chat as well. Yeah, we definitely live in silos for sure. Hopefully this opportunity will provide some connections between programs as well. That the question of implicit bias is a key here. I loved all the discussion about disruption, like just disrupting systems, disrupting assumptions, all of that. The one-dimensional data piece. Okay, so here's a question. I'm just going to throw this out again. This is from Gay. How do you assure that the data that you're using is worthy of making a difference? Perhaps one of our speakers could respond to that question.
I have a thought. And this is part of it. This is a bigger discussion, I think. But I think there's this habit, this compulsion, especially in academia, but in any kind of like leadership position in education, to try and frame data and data analysis as this very positivist practice, right? Like we have these objective data points, and to try and isolate that as much as possible. And that's been the status quo. And the problem is when we do that, then what we're doing is we are ignoring sum to all of a lot of other data points that are hard for us to deal with. Like someone spoke earlier about kind of leaning into Tanika did with the quote from Brene Brown about like being awkward and being able to get, I'm horribly paraphrasing this, but really those messy, sticky situations, right? The ones where we don't have clear answers. And I think that's a big piece of why historically we've tried to gravitate towards easily measurable, clearly defined data. But the problem is humans are not clearly defined. We're not easily measurable. And so there's this disparity between the reality and the data that we're gathering and analyzing. And so I think remembering that objective data is just one small piece of a very large mosaic of information is an important thing to keep in mind, so that we can start to shift our focus and what we value in terms of data to data that's centered on the students. And I think just to kind of end my point here is that's the opportunity we have to start to decentralize some of this power, right? To remove how we want to collect data on students and instead center students or candidates, or for whatever lens we're looking at this from, center them in the process of identifying, observing, and analyzing that data and working through it.
Absolutely.
Thank you,
Can I
Paul. That was
just
very
add
helpful.
something? Oh, sorry. Can I? Oh, Paul, I think it was Jennifer. I want to make sure Jennifer gets credit for the awkward because it wasn't me. So I just want to make sure of that. The data piece is just very interesting, I think. That we start our students thinking about, again, the history of, like, they read a piece on like just the history of standardized testing. Like, again, this goes back to the historical context of it. There's a reason we have these assessments in place, and they are rooted in systemic issues of inequity. And if we don't start with that, then it's really hard for students to imagine other data sources that they can collect that can support what they think they need to do inside of school spaces to move the needle towards equity in their context. And so not only do we ask them to think about the history and why and the politics that come behind the assessments that they're asked to do, even at our own university is asking them to do. Thinking about, we're always asking them, what is the counter narrative? How would you measure liberation? How would you, because if it matters in your school space, how would you measure it? Because the thought behind it for us is that if you don't find the measures to tell your own story, someone will tell it for you. And the story is usually there's a gap between my English language learners and everybody else. The African-American boys, I just don't know what to do. Let me come up with a new thing to do with them. Like, there's some countermeasures that you have to figure out. No one's going to do that for you as a leader. They're not going to do that for you, but they don't imagine anything different about what a measure could be. And we're working on this as well, trying to always think about what would it look like to measure that and try to push back on the notion that the only way we can move inside of school systems as a leader is to decide that this is why everyone should read like Ivory Tolston's work, again, like, don't believe everything you read about, that say that's bad, he calls it bad stats. Right? Because even just the language that we use and how we think about it. So we ask them to think about the language and the questions they ask, but the history for us was important because you won't shift it if you believe this is just the way it's always been done. Not that it's a perfect, I don't know if we never say that that this is good data. It is data within a context, and it is data that you have to really try to create some counter narratives for yourself as school leaders, because the narratives will be told for you, and they have been told for you, which is the same kids are not doing well. We don't need data to tell us that. We know who they are. I don't need a deep dive into that. I know who they are, right? So We just ask them again, start with history and think of some alternative ways that they would think about it. And they do. Like, this is what it will look like. So.
Thank you, Tanika. And I think I'm going to turn it back to Gay now. Is that correct?
James, we have back one more slide,
Oh, I was just looking at our time. I just wanted to,
but they're prepared for a final thought. I think it's
Okay.
worth going over a minute to take a final thought.
so Paul, is there a final thought you'd like to leave the audience with?
I think for me, as I was listening to everyone and reflecting on my own thoughts as well, is just this, part of this radical change in education. I think a big way of facilitating this is, how do we remove power from ourselves, or how do we start to pull away power from the systems that maintain this power? Because as has been said a couple different times now, right? Like, those systems already exist and we already know how they turn out. And so the more we can share this power with our students, with our candidates, with our teachers, if you're in leadership, then I think there's a lot of good to be done in that space.
Thank you. Jennifer, a final thought to leave our participants with.
Sure. I think being a radical disruptor who is kind. So finding a way to step outside the box, but do it knowing, somebody said earlier, it's messy. This is a messy space, but to be okay, to be messy and come back together.
Thank you. And Tanika.
I'll just use my favorite quote from Cornel West, which is, how do we reproduce inequity in our own actions? It's a question I always ask my folks when I teach them. It's a question I ask in all my PDs. The question is not what everyone else needs to do, but how do you reproduce inequity in your own actions? When we think about our assessments, when we think, how do you do it? And that's where we start.
Thank you. And Wes or Anne.
Yeah, thanks so much. I would say that when I reflect on my experience, when I'm lucky enough to be able to spend time in the best schools with the best principals, whether they have 2 years of experience or 22 years of experience, they orient their work, all of the functions around their job, to build the capacity of others, to build the capacity of their teaching colleagues. And so in turn, they model that for their teaching colleagues who are invested in building the capacity of their students. And I think that's really how our work can touch the lives of kids learning in California classrooms.
Great, thank you. Anne, would you like to add to that?
Sure. We know that schools are going to continue to change, and we need to continue to empower our teachers and our administrators to always question and critique. That's how we've always done it. I think that's the first place that we look with suspicion. So thank you.
Great, thank you. And Amy, would you like to wrap us up?
Sure, absolutely. Thank you, James. And we did go a few minutes past, but as Gay said, having our last thoughts is well worth the 2 minutes of extra time. So thank you so much to each of the 5 of our presenters today, and to your colleague who was not able to be with us. We thank you all for your work and what you're doing. What really struck me today was how powerful it was to have those who prepare teachers together talking with those of you who prepare leaders. And we need to stop siloing our work and do more work like this. So thank you for taking your time today. We do have more digging deeper opportunities coming up across the year. We would like all of you to think about what you might want to come forward and present, how you can share your voice. So thanks to all of you, and thanks to the commission staff who put this together. Great work, everyone, and hope you're having the opportunity over the next multiple weeks here during the holiday season to rest a bit and recuperate and take care of yourselves. So thank you.